Nation, again, welcome to MAAFA 2022, the commemoration and also the Social Justice Conference. And last night, we were so blessed. Dr. Joy Orr continued to help us understand our relationship to the land. And Dr. Otis Moss III blessed us with a spectacular, I don't know what you want to call that. It was more than a sermon. It was more than a sermon, a multimedia extravaganza. And we want to again thank Dr. Moss and Trinity for that very powerful recognition that they gave to us yesterday. And thank you so much for that. Thank you, St. Paul and St. Paul Nation, for being so present this week. And for our virtual audience, God bless you. Share this stream. This presentation, I believe, will be a blessing to you as we continue to develop our understanding of the disconnects we have experienced with the land. And again, Joy Orr, Dr. Orr really helped us to understand that in terms of food sovereignty. And we called it land scarcity, but she's called it land theft. She called it land theft. And so she is helping us to truly understand where we are located. As we have covenanted to do every time we gather, let's begin now with a word of prayer. Gracious God, we thank you for this moment. We praise you for our gathering. Thank you for the opportunity to acknowledge our ancestors, to have Sankofa reflections, to go back and get it. Bless us as we continue to hallow this week and keep it sacred and holy. Thank you for the moments that we have deconstructed our trauma. Now, God, give us the grace, the imagination, the black joy and creativity to be able to construct or redesign a new reality. So we ask you to bless us as we come towards the end of this journey. We pray now that you would empower us to go another mile along the way. We thank and praise you in Jesus' name. Amen and amen. Our speaker this morning, his name is KIRK Goodrich. KIRK and St. Paul, KIRK and East Brooklyn congregations have had a long relationship. KIRK serves as the president of Monadnock Development and has more than 30 years of experience in the fields of community development, affordable housing, real estate development. And from 1998 to 2008, KIRK led the housing tax credit syndication business for enterprise community investments. I could go on and on about his accomplishments, but what I would prefer to do before he comes before us, do we have our video ready? Introduction video. I'd like to show you this introduction.
To be recognized by ULI New York's Visionary Leadership and Land Use Award means that you've been recognized by your peers, by the people that you work side by side with, by the people that you do projects with, that are part of the community that you have grown up in.
KIRK has really set himself apart in a long career and a long commitment to affordable housing and improving the communities of New York City. Not many people have had the impact that KIRK has had.
There are not many people who live a life of compassion. That sense of understanding of humanity is a very rare quality in many people, but it is so predominant in KIRK.
KIRK is a true son of New York. His parents came to New York as immigrants. His mother raised his brothers and sister. They grew up in a neighborhood much like all of the neighborhoods that KIRK works in. KIRK and I had the great fortune of meeting in college. I came back to New York, and then a few years later, I had the opportunity to be a part of Enterprise when KIRK was hired there and began his career in New York City.
When we hired him, we looked at someone who was committed to the communities that we worked in and to working closely with our community partners to really achieve affordable housing.
He was really on the financial side of the transactions that create affordable housing. I think he was very committed to ultimately getting to the development side, and he started and made a transition as a consultant to build projects on time under budget, and to really realize the vision of safe, decent, affordable housing.
KIRK has the ability to figure out complex solutions to complex problems. I brought KIRK on to Monadnock over 11 years ago now, and it was at that point I realized that he had the talents to run a whole operation.
I think the secret to KIRK's success is the sincerity and the sense of innocence that he still brings with him.
I have never met in my 30-some years in this business somebody that has more passion and has more commitment deep inside of him for the work that we do.
I think KIRK, more than most, cares about the people that live in the buildings and wants to provide housing for people that don't have it or don't have good options.
He builds for those who will be living in the units. So going from the human perspective into the physical makeup of the building is how he approaches things. People first.
KIRK has held up his end of that bargain because he's done every project that he's ever been a part of the right way.
So KIRK and I worked with the Fortune Society, realized a dream of theirs to build housing for formerly incarcerated individuals. And there wasn't a program or financing for something at that point. And he figured out some financing that would make it financeable. As a result, people who were formerly incarcerated were able to live with dignity in transitional and permanent housing.
Nehemiah Spring Creek is a large urban redevelopment project in East New York that is spearheaded by East Brooklyn congregations. KIRK really has been, for the last several years, the most stalwart partner for East Brooklyn congregations. When KIRK was a young boy, he got to understand what East Brooklyn congregations was doing and the work that they were doing and how they were trying to bring affordable housing and rebuild the neighborhoods that he grew up in Brooklyn.
521 West 145th Street stood vacant for quite some time. We needed the right team. KIRK was that voice of reason. This renovated, saved school building has transformed that particular area, and the families that are living in there are absolutely marveled to be able to have quality housing.
I think it's very important to KIRK to give back. I think there were a few instances in his career where he felt someone gave him special help, and he's very conscious of that.
A big part of what makes KIRK the leader that he is the way that he lifts other people up in our industry.
KIRK has played a key role in shaping my entire career. KIRK said to me one simple thing: "Hey brother, you need to think of yourself as Pierre Inc. because you're pretty good at what you do." And it was the first time in my life where somebody that looked like me, made me feel extremely empowered. And the rest was history. And that was because of that moment when a brother, believed in another young brother.
What's the future hold for KIRK? Oh, I don't know. Governor, mayor, senator, we'll see, but he's had such a tremendous impact to this point. I just think he will continue to do great things. And the impact will probably extend beyond affordable housing, community development, but I can't wait to see what he does next.
My introduction to affordable housing really occurred when I was a teenager.
All right, all right. He deserves an encore. We were getting ready to play it twice. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. KIRK Goodrich.
Good morning, everybody. So I can't tell you how excited I am to be able to stand in this pulpit. Pastor doesn't know this, but I never thought I would stand in a pulpit. My grandmother, before she passed on, asked me two questions because she was my surrogate grandmother, and she said, one, are you my grandson? I said, you're the only one I've ever known. And the second question she said is, you think you'll ever preach? And I said, no. And I still don't think that, but the pastor's working really hard on me, Grandma. He's working. And so two things I want to say. One, thank you so much, Pastor and St. Paul's, for the invitation to be a part of MAAFA, which is an amazing tradition you've established here. The second thing is the only reason I'm in the affordable housing business is because of the work St. Paul's did through EBC, which I saw when I was 13 years old. I didn't know what it was. My undergraduate degree is in housing. I found a place where I could study affordable housing because of you guys. And so you thought you were only building buildings. And so I tell Pastor and the folks at EBC, I don't know whether to thank you or not. Maybe I would be retired by now if I wasn't in all this affordable housing. But there's nothing better than, putting your treasures in heaven where moth, and rust, right, Pastor? I don't want a Lamborghini. I want to change lives and see people stop suffering. Tired of seeing people suffer. And so I can't tell you how much this means to me to be able to stand in front of you in this pulpit. I wanted to share today on developing the land, because that's something that as black folks we need to do, but after we develop it, we need to own it. So I'm gonna amend it, the title of this, to developing and owning the land, and under land owning the land. So Greg, could you give me the PowerPoint? So here it is. So I always like to start with this shot because it gives you a sense of the magic you've been able to do in East New York. I was taking a young lady who's part of the production team on the Stephen Colbert show, who's a friend of a friend, through Spring Creek. And when she got out of the Uber, I told her that there's not a single time I go to Spring Creek that I don't get emotional. Because if you knew what East New York was in the 70s and you stand in Spring Creek, you feel like you're in the suburbs of Maryland or Arizona or something. It's amazing. I say it's a magical place. But since I'm in the house of God, I'll say it's a blessed, sacred place. And so I just love this shot. Greg, could you go to the next slide? I want to start, before I talk about developing and owning the land, I want to start where the pastor left off this morning about theft of the land, because for black folks, it's been a long journey. And the one thing I'll tell you, I'm a partner and president of Monadnock Development, and we do a lot of development. We've probably done more than 9,000 units in the last decade. And so I own a piece of the company, but one thing I'll say to you is the world of real estate development is inhospitable to black folks. I'll say that again. The world of real estate development is inhospitable to black folks. Have you ever gone to a hotel or a party or a gathering or maybe a church in another city where folks don't look like us, and you step in and everybody, right. That's how it feels as a black developer and as a black person in real estate. Like, who invited you? And the reality is that it's not set up for us to succeed and own. Before I get to this, I'll talk about the most pressing thing on my head right now is deed fraud. In our city, people just outright stealing, forging deeds and stealing property. Later today, I'll send out some information on it, but if you've been reading anything about it, deed fraud is rampant in our city. And I'm confident when the research is done years from now, when they dig deep, they'll probably find out that 90-some-odd% of the deeds stolen are on homes owned by old black folks. I don't think there's any question about that. The reality of the situation is that while we build homes for people to own, folks on the back end are stealing homes through deed fraud. And so owning it, developing and owning is great. Now, Pastor, we got to worry about keeping it. And so the world of real estate development is inhospitable to black folks. So I want to give you some background. Most of this stuff you probably know or heard, but the idea of black folks owning homes was never part of the equation, even for the federal government. Redlining, and there's a whole book that was recently published on this called The Color of Law by Richard Rothstein, but the practice of redlining really relied on maps that were produced by the federal government through the FHA. Before they put mortgage insurances on the property, they really wanted to make sure that where they insured properties were in areas that that they could trust. And so as they created these maps, the areas that they felt were high risk areas that they redlined tended to be areas where we lived. And so when a lender or a developer was looking to lend money and build, if they wanted mortgage insurance, which if you do any projects of scale, even now, you need that, but back then, the FHA was the only game in town, you weren't going to build in areas that were redlined. That's just the way it was. Not only that, but in order to ensure that those areas stayed, white, primarily white, what we saw is a whole industry, a creation of restrictive covenants. And ironically, Pastor, in East Flatbush, on East 49th Street, right by Kingsbrook Jewish Hospital, and I'll show you the project we're doing there in a moment, we were moving towards closing in December, and the title company said they found a restrictive covenant on every property on that block, which is a black community, and none of the homeowners realized this, but we discovered that there's a restrictive covenant that says use and occupancy by Caucasians only. And we in 2022. And so this shows you how prevalent it was, that if you were going to do any sort of real estate development of scale, whether it's homeownership or rental, restrictive covenants were just part of the equation. And so the deck has been stacked against us forever. There are other elements of this. Blockbusting, where real estate agents would, scare white families into selling, buy their homes at a discount and then rent it to black folks. That's, something that was commonplace. But what's amazing, while that was happening on the financial side to make sure that we couldn't buy and own, I was in a presentation. I'm chairman of the board of the New York State Association for Affordable Housing. We had a conference upstate, and there was a young man named Adam Paul Sissonek who's created a body of research called Segregation by Design, and his area of study is how urban renewal, eminent domain, and transportation funding from the federal government has been used in more than 180 cities to really, dispossess black people of their property for generations now. So if you go to any city, and including our city, and you look at where the expressways were, overwhelmingly, in order to build the expressways, they had to take people's homes. And overwhelmingly, not only in New York, but he studied 180 cities, those are principally people of color who were poor, who were displaced. Urban renewal, same thing. Using eminent domain, which is the public taking, the taking of property by a government agency for public purposes. So taking private property for government purposes has disproportionately affected people of color. There are cities and communities that are 80%, white, and when you look at the taking of property for eminent domain for these purposes, more than 80% of the properties are from people of color. So I've included on the bottom of this slide, just so you know, I generally like to have my facts right. So on the matter of redlining, I included a link here, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America, Richard Rothstein, and Segregated by Design, Adam Paul Sissonek, who wrote an article for the New York Times that has a body of research on this. So if anybody wants to not take my word for it, feel free to do that. But I wanted to establish Pastor, that this idea, like some people think that we magically just don't own as much property as white folks. They think it's just, I don't know, something's wrong with it. And you need to understand, this is a systematic, deliberate collaboration between government and the private sector, backed by the law, because restrictive covenants are law, over many, and federal policy over many generations. And so we all need to understand that. Could we have the next slide, please? I want to talk for a minute about what the impact is, right? Rather than just telling you that, these things happened, I want to share with you what the actual impact has been. So when you look at the statistics, this was published, the first bullet point was published in the Washington Post. It's a Federal Reserve study. Black families have about 13% of the wealth of white families. And when you understand that the components of wealth, so typically 63% of a family's wealth comes from owning property and from retirement accounts. Owning property and retirement accounts. So if we're not owning property in the same way other folks are, we can't build wealth in the way other folks have. And so when you look at black ownership, 44% of black households own, 73% of white households do. 87% of white homeowners buy their first home before 35. It's only 53% for us. Homes in black neighborhoods were undervalued by $48,000, all else being equal. And then homes in black neighborhoods that are at least 50%, so homes in neighborhoods at least 50% were worth half of what the homes were in other neighborhoods. And then here's the summary of this. We buy at lower rates, we buy later, and when we do buy, our homes are worth less. We buy later, we buy at lower rates, and when we do buy, our homes are worth less. You need to understand that. Next slide. So when we talk about creating wealth in black communities, we can't disconnect the concept of owning, of developing and owning land from wealth. That's sort of a fundamental thing. But when I talk about creating black wealth, I think about it in three ways, and this is really important. I think about families and individuals getting wealth. I think about black businesses being created and growing. And then the third thing, and Pastor, this is probably the most important one in many ways, I think about black institutions, whether they be houses of worship, faith-based organizations, cultural and arts institutions, service organizations, health organizations. These are institutions that are community-based, that are led by black folks, have boards of directors that are majority black. Institutions in these communities should be able to build wealth and have wherewithal. It's rare that you go into a white community that has resources and find that their institutions are poor. I want to say that again. It's very rare that you go into a white community that has resources and you find that their institutions are broke down and poor. We can't just think about building wealth for ourselves. We have to create a situation where the institutions that support our community are doing well. That's very important. That's perpetual. These institutions are perpetual. They serve us. They serve our spiritual needs, our arts and cultural needs. Think about the arts and cultural institutions in the city of New York. You ever go to Museum Mile? Do those institutions look like they're broke? You ever see the Met Gala where they make tons of money? Often in our community, creating wealth for the institutions that serve us and support us seems secondary. And I'm telling you that it's as important to make sure those institutions are well-funded and their fortunes are growing right along with the fortunes of the people who live in the community. And what I want to do as I walk through a series of images, I'm going to tell you as I go through the image how that particular project either created personal wealth, how it enhanced black business enterprise, or how it created institutional wealth. One of those three things. Some of these will be all three, but it's really important for me. I'm a really practical person, and from my perspective, we got to ask the hard questions when we're doing projects. I've never wanted to be a part of a company or business that enriches me and my kids while the rest of the world burns and suffers. And I think that's part of our faith as Christian people. I think family is important, but I think from my perspective, we ought to be salt and light. And if you're not impacting people's lives, if you're not responding to suffering, if you're not helping everybody move ahead, then from my perspective, you're not fulfilling your mission, as a person of faith. And so what I want to do now is I want to walk through some projects and just give you a sense of how we've been able to create wealth and opportunity for individuals, black enterprise, and for institutions. Next slide. I kind of talked through this slide already. So let's go to the next one. So Nehemiah is an easy one. But the one thing, Pastor, I noted from the piece, and Pastor was just amazing in the piece with Ed Koppel, the most important part of that was the estimate that $1.5 billion worth of equity was created by the work at Nehemiah for individuals. And, I'm going to tell you, I grew up in the affordable housing world, and people in the affordable housing world very liberal people, they tend to be concerned about helping folks, helping the poorest. And my position is we definitely need safety nets, but we need elevators. We got to lift people up. And the focus nowadays is on community land trust, which is important stuff. You want to keep property affordable in perpetuity. But I always say to elected officials and government agency folks, when they talk about community land trusts, I say, well, if you believe that you should put property you own in a land trust, then and not get anything from it, why don't you start with putting your home in there? They want us to put our property in there. They want folks who look like us to put our property in land trust and not build any wealth, but they won't do it. And they always, I was telling somebody yesterday, I said, folks are good for experimenting on us. I said, they really don't think about, they don't think we want what they want. And that's the problem. And so, the ability to create wealth for folks and not, listen, helping the poorest of the poor is important. At the same time, we can walk and chew gum, and we really need to create a path for people to be upwardly mobile, because we got a lot of catching up to do. You saw the stats at the beginning. We were left behind and left out. And so from my perspective, we need to be about elevators and upward mobility. And Nehemiah is about upward mobility, and that's really important. Next slide. These are just more images of it. We could go to the next slide. Same thing. I think you guys are familiar with Nehemiah. I don't need to talk a whole lot about that. Can I have the next slide? The one thing I do want to talk about, the home ownership, we know how that's created wealth for homeowners. The EBC folks have gotten what's called developer fee from that, which is really important. The other part of this is we've done, in Spring Creek alone, we have about 2,000 units on the drawing board. And there will be about 1,400 units of rental. Rental housing is really important because when you own rental housing, you get residual income from it. And so the one thing I will say, with respect to the work we're doing now out there is that whereas when EBC and folks who ran the organization sold homes, it was a one-shot deal, helped residents, there was some fee. Owning rental housing is going to enable the organization to be self-sustaining going forward. And so when we talk about creating wealth and residual, this is very different. This happens to be a senior housing project we're going to do. This is very different from the home ownership activity the organization has done traditionally. And not only should we think about owning our own home, but once you've owned your own home, looking at the prospects to own a rental property as individuals is important too. For the same reason we've pivoted to doing it for EBC, rental income, residual income, helping to run the organization, that's a change in direction in terms of long-term income. Next slide. So St. Paul's, I don't need to tell you guys about this, you've heard a lot, but what's important about this, you should know, is that, the long-term ownership of the asset, a lot of churches throughout the city are being defrauded, making bad business decisions. You read newspapers, you watch programming, you see that there are a lot of folks making bad decisions about their property. And the uniqueness of the St. Paul's deal is not only it's going to be transformative, 600 units, parking, et cetera, a new church, but the long-term ownership of the asset is going to remain with St. Paul's. And that's really important. It seems like a simple thing, but when people have bad advice or no advice or think they know what they don't know, they end up in a very different place. And so I brought this slide up to point out that your leadership is making the kind of decision that's going to secure the future of the church and create that institutional wealth that I was talking about at the beginning. Next slide. That's right. But the other thing, Pastor, which is terrible, there's a court case where a series of pastors made a business deal that was below market and got some money from the developer behind the scenes. And so, there are a lot of things people do, both out of ignorance and greed, and it's like a minefield, right? To be able to navigate that and get to where you want to be is really important. And so, like I said before, that's about leadership and vision and integrity. I brought this slide up. So this is a senior building. There's an organization in the Bronx called Mid-Bronx Desperados. It's now called MBD Community Housing Corporation. And it's run by a guy named Derek Lovett, who's one of my close friends. But when Derek took over more than a decade ago, the organization wasn't doing really well. And what Derek focused on doing was refinance of assets and controlling them. But he didn't have a lot of expertise, so he partnered with our company. And this is one building, but we did a total of 22 buildings with him, 645 units. And we closed the financing in 2012, 2013. We renovated it. We all got paid. And then last year, we withdrew, and MBD owns the entire 22 buildings, 645 units. The organization is an amazing place. They just built a beautiful building on the Grand Concourse. They have capital. They're moving. And it's one of the best examples I've seen of a institution that served the African American and Latino community really being able to build wealth and do things. And from my perspective, that doesn't happen by accident. It happens because people are very intentional about making sure that they create wealth and retain it. Next slide. So Compass, this is actually another thing we did with MBD. It's 1,300 units, all new construction along the West Farms Road, along the Sheridan Expressway. And so after we did 645 units, we did another 1,347. And so again, really the focus on creating wealth and and at the same time, like you've done here in Brooklyn, transforming the community. Next slide. These are just interior shots of Compass. So the other thing that you'll see, which is consistent with EBC and what the pastor's vision for St. Paul is, we create affordable housing, but don't look affordable. It's a lot of people I know, they wear very nice clothing, but don't need to be expensive, right? And so from my perspective, we create affordable housing, and our goal is to create a market rate product that people can afford. And I wanted to pull this slide up just so you could see what I'm talking about. Next slide. So the Boys and Girls Club, the Boys and Girls Club was in the video. I want to give you a little history. Convent Avenue Baptist Church, Pastor Williams, Convent Avenue Baptist Church incubated the Boys and Girls Club of Harlem, which provides after-school services, and summer classes and a bunch of things for folks in Harlem. But it was a small 3,000 square foot facility on the back of Convent Avenue Baptist Church for many, many years. In fact, they bought this property from the city in 1986, intending to renovate it into a Boys and Girls Club, but they didn't have the financing or the expertise to do it. It was a very complicated project. And so they brought me in, and then I brought in Monadnock when I got there. And go to the next slide. So we created two things. So we created a project that has 78 units of affordable housing. It's beautiful, historic renovation. Most importantly, there's a 9,000 square foot. We tripled the size of the Boys and Girls Club. This is a 9,000 square foot Boys and Girls Club condominium. They're renting it for $1, and then in year 15, they will acquire the condominium for $1. And so that space is probably worth between $5 and $7 million. And they'll own the condominium. And so the idea there is we created an asset for them. And they have the ability to now do other programming, and that's part of their balance sheet. So that's, in addition to creating affordable housing, that's something we've been able to do. Next slide. So this building is important. So there's a guy named Craig Livingston who's an African-American developer. The name of his company is Exact Capital. He was just getting the business started in 2011, and he called me and he said, "No, Kirk, look, we got these properties under foreclosure. It was a total of 99 units in 3 buildings in the Bronx, but we need some help in terms of financing and signing guarantees." And so we came in and we partnered with them, and that was the beginning of his business. And we renovated all 99 units. It's cash flowing. It's a great asset. He owns 45%, we own 45%, and the property manager owns 10%. And he was able to go from launching this, and soon he's opening the new Victoria Theater and Tower with a hotel in Harlem on 125th Street. And he's in Atlanta doing business. He's in Indianapolis. He's in Oklahoma. But this was his first project. And his uncle, some might know, was Phil Morrow, who ran Sobro, South Bronx Overall Development Corporation, and did a lot of work with churches. So this is an example of a young brother who was new to development business, we partnered with, and a decade later, he's doing big things. Next slide. So this is Fort Washington. It's a New York Housing Authority project. So we're in 70% complete with doing renovating 1,700 units in 41 buildings across 16 developments in Manhattan, mostly in Harlem and Washington Heights. And our team is Pierre Downing, who you saw in the video, Kalel Holdings, black developer, Lee Moore Realty, Kenny Morrison, his father was Leroy Morrison, a Harlem-based black developer, our company, Community League of the Heights, Yvonne Stennett, who you saw, who's been operating for 70 years in Community League. And so we have an ownership team that's diverse. We're renovating it. It's a $440-something million development, 1,700 units. 99-year lease, and we have 2 majority black developers in it and Community League of the Heights. It's amazing. Next slide. So this is our next project in Brooklyn, Stuyvesant Gardens along Gates near Lewis. Most of you probably know that area. So we got awarded round 10 to do 900 units. And again, the team is diverse. Bed-Stuy Restoration, most of you know. Colvin Granum, and now Blondell Pinnock runs it, who's a friend, both friends of mine. And then, and talking about local community-based institutions, Bed-Stuy Restoration was the very first community development corporation in the United States in 1968. And so really thrilled to partner with them. And then Kalel Holdings, Pierre Downing again. We've done, with Pierre, we've done a total of maybe 3,000 units of housing. And he's created he's a young guy, he's created a big business for himself, and he employs a lot of people of color, and he's partnering with folks. And so, the idea here is to partner with community institutions, Bed-Stuy Restoration, St. Paul's, Mid-Bronx Desperados, Community League of the Heights. You see a pattern developing here past the EBC. That's not an accident, by the way, because instead of calling Bed-Stuy, I could call Catholic Charities. Instead of, you see what I mean? And we're partnering with Catholic Charities. There's nothing wrong with Catholic Charities. They've been part of our network. I'm just saying it's really important if we're going to redress and deal with some of the historic issues we've had, we have to be very intentional about creating wealth for individuals, for black business, and for institutions. The thing that cuts through all of this, the other thing I want to say about the NYCHA stuff I didn't even mention, SLM Architecture, who's run by a woman named Shanika Henry, black woman, was the architect on the 1,700 NYCHA units and did an amazing job and is on this as well. So we're not only looking at partnering with black developers, contractors, architects. The idea here is to create infrastructure of folks who can be involved. Real estate brokers. I have many of my friends who are black real estate brokers. We got to create an infrastructure of folks in the real estate industry and feed their business, support their business. Next slide. This is one of 2 projects we're doing in my neighborhood, East Flatbush, where I live now, and it's on the campus of King's Jewish Hospital. This is about 300 units. And go to the next slide. This one is about 322 units. They're side by side. It's over 600 units. The partners here in this are CB Emanuel, so Chris Bramwell. Chris is also executive at Shinda. So Shinda Management was like the very first black management company in the city of New York, property management company. It's 45 years old. It's founded by Richard Bramwell. And so Chris, in addition to running Shinda, formed a business called CB Emanuel, which is a 17-year-old black development company. They're a partner on this, and they are both involved on the property management side and the development side. In addition to that, there's a smaller partner is J.L. James, who I think was a member here at some point. But she is a small partner on this property in particular. And so on this, our MBE minority ownership is like 30%. And so we have done many, many projects where we have black developers involved, black-run nonprofits involved, and with respect to home ownership in particular, we have ownership creating individual and family wealth that can be passed on. And those are the most important things. I don't know. I don't want to talk forever. I want to leave some time for questions. But I wanted to, one, just lay out the vision that we're really got to focus not only on building wealth for ourselves, not only on creating businesses, but the last thing in many ways is more important because institutions survive us and our kids. And the only reason that amazing things have happened in East New York and Brownsville, in the Mid-Bronx, in Washington Heights is because these institutions who we've partnered with have existed. And when everybody was gone and found a better place to live and didn't want to be in these neighborhoods, these institutions stayed and, turned them around. And so I think creating wealth in institutions is something that we need to prioritize and think about and be very intentional about. I'm going to stop there, Pastor.
All right. Thank you so much. KIRK Goodrich, please stay. We want to ask you some questions.
Okay.
And I want to lead off, and our AV team has done a phenomenal job this week, so thank God for all the images we've seen today. But what I'd like to do is I'd like to ask the first question. And thank you for this brilliant presentation, and I think your grandmother would be pleased. You sound like a frustrated preacher today. That's number one. But you speak as a person who responded to a call. And so often we're limited in our understanding of calling and aligning our passion and our calling. And I just want you to talk a little bit about your sense of call to this work. It is definitely ministry, and it is truly transformational. And perhaps there are some young people watching via stream, or we can share this with our young people. Can you talk about responding to that call?
Absolutely, and thank you, Pastor, for sharing that. It is a call. So I grew up in the church. I tell people, I was talking about 35 years of Sundays. I started really going to church when I was 9, and then, and I'll be transparent, 35 years later, when I was 44, I'm 54 now. I haven't gone to church regularly for 10 years. It's not an accident. I was devout. I love God. My frustration is I couldn't reconcile the suffering I saw around me, in my neighborhood, in my family, in my community, with a lot. And St. Paul's is an exception, definitely. But I couldn't reconcile the suffering and the urgency I saw around me with the inaction of a lot of the churches I was a part of. And I believe in prayer. I believe in altar calls. I was rescued by my church. But at the end of the day, we got to do what Jesus said, go. And the church is the locker room. It's the place we rest up and learn and get trained. It's the boot camp. But the war is out there. And somehow you always got that. And I always wonder why certain places of worship get it and others don't. But I could tell you, you're unique. I think I always tell people I don't take credit for all the good things that have happened in my life and the work I've done with others. I think, when you see suffering up close in your family and community, it transforms you. I grew up in a single-parent household. We didn't have a lot. And either you can watch the 11 o'clock news, see people hurting, and say, that's really bad. Honey, you got any potato chips left? Or you say, I gotta do something. You don't worry about somebody else is doing, who else is going. Sometimes you say, I gotta go. And in that sense, Pastor, you're right. I've always felt like I gotta do something about it. One of my partners, businessmen, they're not bad guys, but they're about business. So one of my partners always says, you can't help everybody. And I was like, yeah, but you can want to. You can want to. And so anyway, you're right, Pastor. I appreciate that. Can I tell you, in your head, you have an idea about what you think the Christian walk should be. But I appreciate St. Paul so much because what I thought in my prayer room when I was a teenager Christianity should be, you guys are.
We're going to open up the floor. There are microphones to my right and my left. If you want to ask a question of Kirk, feel free.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you so much. Oh my gosh. This presentation was so touching. I really appreciate it because I feel like you've sort of echoed something that I've always felt. And that is that I don't want East New York, Brownsville to disappear. I don't want that to ever happen. We're like encroached. There are barriers all around us waiting to come in. And it's scary. You know, all of a sudden you see people that are not from here running through, where they going? You know what I'm saying?
Right.
There's nothing down there. Oh, you know what I'm saying? And you wonder, what can I do? You know, how do we fill in this gap? My question to you is exactly that. Protect intentionally. Protect, protect, protect. I am a person who I don't mean to go long, but I come back to the neighborhood. You know, I go to college and I come back. Oh, it's still the same. I go here and I come back. Oh, there ain't nothing changed. You know, people are literally dying in their homes. And I'm wondering, you know, how can I be a part of the intentional protections that you're talking about? First of all, what are the protections? You know, they're not selling their house. The kids don't necessarily come back to help mom and dad. I'm like, who's helping you? And we noticed this during COVID. During COVID, these old people were in their houses by themselves.
Right.
And I'm saying, I know how I am with my mom and my family. Do you have a trust? Do you have insurance? These people are vulnerable. What do we do? Because, I'll buy up the houses. You know, I want to be part of a movement that keeps ownership in our bloodlines. And also, so let me know, because, you know, I see these little Hasidic people walking up and down our blocks.
We're good.
You understand? No, I'm serious, you know, and they're walking up and down the street like they own our community, and it's scary. Thank you.
Great question.
So I think it is, from my perspective, it's really important that you are part of organizations and churches that think the way we do, because I think the work is too big for one person to do. You know, I think I think education is important. I don't think we do a good enough job of, particularly on deed fraud, that's purely about education and opportunity with people being isolated. And so I think the point you were making about people being alone and isolated is really maybe the most important one. And from my perspective, I always say the problem I think we have generally is that we're really focused only on ourselves, our immediate needs, our kids, and I think we have to have a more robust vision where we really look to be supportive and engaged with people around us who may not be related to us. I think we all need to do that. And then I think we need to be a part of institutions that are engaged in educating and are active, you know, and I use St. Paul's a lot, EBC, there are other institutions and churches, but we can't do it alone. It's too big a task. And I realized that, you know, at a really young age, to really find people who are like-minded, that's the formula for, you know, for a lot of what's right, I think. Pastor, I have to run to Manhattan, but I could do like a couple more questions.
Okay, I just wanted to come behind that question. Land trust. I know you have to get, thank you for your time today, Kirk. I just wanted you to just touch on land trust, and then there are two more. Sure. One question per person questions coming up.
So land trusts are a vehicle where the ownership is of a piece of property or properties are owned by an entity that has a responsibility to keep, you know, the particular use. In a lot of cases, it's affordable housing, to keep it affordable in perpetuity. I think it's an effective tool. I started learning about land trusts when I was 19 and other forms of social housing. I think I think land trusts are important to create long-term ownership and affordability. What I worry about is it's not a substitute for you owning. Like, in addition to that, we should also own as individuals. And I think what I worry about, policymakers see it as a substitute for having people of color build wealth. It's not. It's a part of the overall palette of options, and that should include some community ownership and some individual ownership and wealth building.
Last two questions.
Thank you, sir. I was told a long time ago that people were not meant to live on top of one another the way we do in projects or houses. What's your stance on that? That we're not meant to live, like I grew up in the projects, right? 22 floors, 8 families on the floor. We're not meant. What's your view about that?
I think it's a good question. I think density in and of itself is not, I call it density when people live in apartment buildings, et cetera. I don't think density is bad. I think the execution of it is what matters. So fascinatingly enough, there are people who grew up in public housing in the 50s in parts of the city who would tell you they had very different experiences than folks have now. And I think that has a lot to do with the management of the properties, amenities, programming, and so it's all in the execution. If you go to the senior housing that EBC and the pastor led that we opened up a couple of years ago in Spring Creek, that's very dense. You got 80 units in that building, but it's spectacular. People live up and down, Park Avenue and Central Park West in multifamily buildings. So I'm just saying, I think it's about execution, maintenance, long-term stewardship more than it is just density.
Thank you for being here. In reference to deed fraud, what are some of the variables that we should be aware of, and what do we look for in terms of security and securing our homes to prevent deed fraud?
So there, I think it takes a lot of different forms. People could just forge your deed and you won't be aware of it, which happened to a friend of mine I grew up with, but whose parents were in the 80s. I'm just telling you, when the study comes out, it's going to be, a really high percentage of these people are going to be African-American older people who get defrauded. But there's an article that was in the Times, I think, a few weeks ago, where there's actually individuals going around asking if you need a loan, you think you're signing a loan, and then you're signing your property over. And so I would say that seek counsel, whether it's from your church or from an attorney don't sign anything without counsel. And so the most brazen thing is what I just described. Somebody says, oh, you need some money, I'm going to make you a loan, and you think you're getting a loan, and then you sign the property over. That was a particular case where somebody did that to like many homeowners. So I would just say that's important, and you should be careful with that.
Brothers
Thank
and
you
sisters,
so much. I really appreciate it.
Let's thank our presenter today, Mr. KIRK Goodrich. Thank you so much. Blessings. I'm going to take that with you, Dad. Here you go. All right. Please be seated. Mr. Goodrich has to go on to Manhattan, and he's the only one who's going to leave right now, so we're going to stay for just a moment. I want to just remind you of tonight. Tonight is the last opportunity to see our presentation. That's right. Give KIRK another big hand. Probably one of the most important presentations this week, right? All of them were outstanding. That's an important conversation to be having, and we're going to make sure on our social media platforms that people have access to this information. Tonight is the last opportunity to just be in the house, to be a part of history making. Our cast has done a phenomenal job of telling the story. You don't want to miss that. And then Dr. Melva Sampson. And if you've not heard Dr. Melva Sampson, trust me on this one. Just trust me on this one. You're not going to want to miss her. She can preach. And she is, without a doubt, one of the foremost thinkers on ritual in our country, and you're not going to want to miss her. And then, of course, Sunday, don't forget Saturday morning. Where are we? We're at the Seaside. Somebody said, you're going to be at the Seaside. I heard you. No, you're going to be at the Seaside with me, right? All right, we're going to the Seaside for the sunrise closeout. And then we're adding this on to the schedule Sunday morning, Dr. Emma Jordan Simpson, the president of Auburn Seminary, will be with us, and this is our commissioning service. So after all this information, right, we need to have a sense of spiritual send-off into the work. And we'll talk more about that on Sunday, but I wanted to make sure you had all that information. Greg, do you have that video I asked for? You do. All right, I'll see you tonight at 7 o'clock. This is our closeout video for this session.
Baobabs are long-lived deciduous, small to large trees with broad trunks and compact crowns. There are 8 species of baobabs which make up the genus Adansonia and are native to the mainland African continent, Madagascar, and Australia. Baobabs are typically found in dry, hot savannas of sub-Saharan Africa, where they dominate the landscape and whose presence in that landscape act as location markings of a water source from far away. The origin of the baobab predates human history, and its lifespan encompasses thousands of years and has been subject to much conjecture, with radiocarbon dating providing the most accurate age-measuring data. General agreement of the median age range ranges between 2,000 to 3,000 years. Baobabs store water in their trunk to endure harsh drought conditions. The average baobab tree can store up to 32,000 U.S. gallons of water in their trunk. The unique shape of the baobab with its vast trunk, combined with its unique water storage capabilities, make it an essential hub of life activity. Older baobab trees are often its own ecosystem, as it supports the life of countless creatures, from the largest of mammals to the thousands of tiny creatures scurrying in and out of its crevices. There are important nest sites for birds, baboons devour the fruit, bush babies and fruits drink the nectar, and in return pollinate the flowers. Elephants routinely eat the lower bark of trees and have even been known to knock down dying trees to consume them. Traditionally, baobab leaves, bark, and seeds have been used to treat almost any disease, including malaria, tuberculosis, fever, microbial infections, diarrhea, anemia, toothache, and dysentery. The leaves and fruit pulp have been used to reduce fever and stimulate the immune system. The leaves are also used to treat kidney and bladder disease, asthma, insect bites, and several other maladies. A study conducted by Oxford Brookes University found that polyphenol-rich baobab fruit extract, once baked in bread, reduced starch digestion and glycemic response in humans. The massive water storage capabilities of the baobab enable it to produce leaves and fruit which are widely used for their nutritional benefits. The baobab fruit, which grows up to a foot long, can be eaten or soaked in water to make a refreshing beverage. They can also be roasted and ground up to make a hot drink, similar to coffee. Baobab powder can be used in smoothies and included in food recipes. Fresh baobab leaves provide an edible vegetable similar to spinach and is also commonly used as a relish. Fiber from the bark is used to make rope, baskets, cloth, musical instrument strings, and waterproof hats. Pollen from the African and Australian baobabs is mixed with water to make glue. Women in Africa have turned to the baobab fruit as a natural source of health and beauty and have used the oils from the seeds for cosmetic purposes for centuries. Think of our community, and while you're at it, think of the community that we have imagined. A community that is self-sufficient as the baobab tree. As the baobab tree provides shelter, food and water, medicine, and the needs of a community, so will the baobab village.